Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Is My Child Being Denied FAPE, Free and Appropriate Public Education? Today, we're going to do kind of a back to basics by special request. We are going to talk about IEPs and 504s and the differences between them and mistakes that parents commonly make in dealing with schools and administrators and specialists or other members of the IEP team. So before we get there, let's just quickly, we haven't talked about COVID-19 in a few days. So I thought today I would start by giving you some information about that. First and foremost, I love stats, and so this is the current graph from the state of Michigan. So you can see that the curve is definitely flattening. We are not at a peak, although there are some interesting things happening. And if you watch any, national news coverage, you'll see that there's been recent spikes around the country, and Michigan was actually mentioned. And as we talked about a little bit last week, that's because of what's going on the western side of the state. But on the ground, our biggest problem in Michigan and why our numbers are not necessarily accurate is because we don't have consistent reporting from labs. And so we get day-to-day data, but it's not with all labs reporting day-to-day. However, by all the key indicators and the science, Michigan is not spiking right now. They are tracking every day, and they'll continue to track so that if there is a spike, the governor can act accordingly. Our stay-at-home order was lifted on June 1st, as everyone knows. But today, the stats are that there are 60,189 total cases in Michigan. There's been 5,790 total deaths, which again is right around 10%, give or take the day, which is a lot. And so we had a day with 60 new cases, and then the next day we had a day with 180 new cases. And that's why there's confusion about if there's a spike or not. So you just need to remember that we don't have uniformity in reporting test results. And so there's going to be some variance between one day and another. So now getting into our topic of the day. And actually, before I do that, if you could all do me a favor, we are trying to accomplish two different things on social media that just really help the firm. So if you have not actually liked our page, if you wouldn't mind just checking the box to like our page, that really helps us to promote the firm and provide this information more regularly to more people. The other thing is that Kirsch Daskas Law Group has a YouTube channel, and as soon as we have 100 subscribers to the YouTube channel, we can get our own URL, and we'll have that as a link so that people can access the information easier in the YouTube format as opposed to the Facebook format. So before we start, I wanted to just kind of give you some educational insight as to the terms that are used. And you often hear the expression, the ABCs of special ed. And it's true, everything in special ed has an acronym. There's the IDEA, which is the Individual Disabilities Education Act. There is the IEP, which is the Individualized Education Plan. There's an FBA, which is a Functional Behavioral Assessment. What we do is we basically just have a list of all of the latest and greatest abbreviations and acronyms that are being used in the special ed community. We give that to our clients, and if anyone wants a copy of that, just stick it in the comments or send me a messenger or an email, and we're happy to get that out to you right away. We could also post it on the Facebook page if people want that to happen. So basically, the reason that we're having these discussions, the reason IEPs exist, the reason 504 plans exist, and we will go through the difference in a minute, is because it was found to be discriminatory where children with disabilities were not receiving the same education or the same opportunity to be educated as students without disabilities. So in an effort to level the playing field, which is an expression you hear all the time in this context, different legislation was written and adopted and is now the law, federal law, as well as state laws are involved in the educational process. And all of it is to guarantee a free, appropriate public education to any qualified handicapped person. That's a lot of words with a lot of meanings packed in them. So basically, free, appropriate public education is known as FAPE, F-A-P-E. And a recipient that operates a public elementary or secondary education program or activity shall provide a free, appropriate public education to each qualified handicapped person who is in the recipient's jurisdiction, regardless of the nature of the disability or the severity of the person's handicap. So what is an appropriate education? It's easier for me to explain what it's not. It's not the best education. It's an appropriate education. So if child is the next Albert Einstein, they do not have to give access to AP physics. They do have to give access to physics if the general ed population has access to physics. And in order to make that person have the ability to learn in the physics environment and to accomplish and achieve whatever supports and accommodations, modifications to the learning system need to be made are going to be made so that the child can excel in the same way, or be successful, I guess is a better term, in the same way that a student without a disability can. Appropriate education has been defined as a provision of regular or special education and related aids and services that are designed to meet individual educational needs of handicapped persons as adequately as the needs of non-handicapped persons are met. And they're based upon adherence to procedure that satisfy the requirements of the law. The way that they spell out those requirements would be either in an IEP or in a 504 plan. An IEP is mandated by the IDEA, which is part of the Education of the Handicapped Act, otherwise known as the ADA, American Disabilities Act, where a 504, which is a less strict document, less requirements to be entitled to one or to have one, is part of civil rights legislation. So in their source, they are different in that way. An IEP also It has to explain, an IEP isn't automatic. You have to qualify to and have certain disabilities in order to be um, to make that resource available to you, an IEP. And then just going back to our definitions of free appropriate public education, free does not mean free. It means free without cost to the handicapped person or his or her parents, except for any fees that would be imposed on non-handicapped students. So like a pay to play or field trip fee or anything like that. It talks about educational settings, and it that basically counts as any place that provides education of each qualified handicapped person in its jurisdiction, to the extent that it provides that for non-handicapped students. The most important thing to understand when you are beginning to explore whether or not your child needs to have a special plan for learning, there's a couple things that you should consider to prepare for that meeting, or prepare for that ask. So under the IDEA, there's something called child find. And child find is basically criteria that when an educator or a daycare provider or a parent, but the parent doesn't have an obligation, if they see a child struggling or they see a child with attention issues or trouble following directions, there's all kinds of cues. And then they can make a referral to have that child evaluated to see if they qualify for services and accommodations to help them succeed in school. If the child is found, then they would proceed through the process of evaluation, and then either an IEP or a 504 plan. But if the parents recognize something or concerned with something, it's up to the parents to notify the school that they want their child evaluated. It's a no-cost evaluation, and then if the results come back and a parent is dissatisfied or doesn't think it was complete, or it for any reason, they can ask for an independent educational evaluation called an IEE, and they can proceed with selecting the evaluator to do that, and the district would have to pay for that. When parents are preparing to go to an IEP meeting, there are 4 basic mistakes that we see that parents make all the time. I guess there's 5, because the not asking for the evaluation when you're concerned about your child could be considered number 1. But these are kind of the 4 biggies that we see, is that IEPs are projective and goals are set in the future based on baseline data of where the child is performing right now. So one of the problems that we see is that parents don't make a long-term plan for their child's education or the future. They're not looking at long range. They're looking at kindergarten. They're not looking at, their senior year in high school, and if there's even going to be high school, if it's going to be vocational school, or what it's possibly going to look like. Are they going to go to college? Are they going to get a job? What kind of job? And depending on the age of the child and the nature of the disability, those questions can be asked, and there can be counseling available to figure it out. But you want to really know if your child's a child that's going to go into an independent living situation, or are they going to be under your care, or in group home, It's just going to depend on what the disability is, and you need to be very forward thinking about that. Your plan should also include social and emotional goals, hobbies, personal interests, sports and fitness, family, friendships, relationship with the community. And this part of the plan should be revisited every year when you revise the plan. So, so that is number two. Number three, which, and this one is probably the biggest issue. A lot of parents are very deferential to the school. They're very deferential to the IEP team. They look at them as that these are the professionals, these people are trained. I don't need to necessarily advocate for my child. They know what they're supposed to do, they're going to do it. Well, in theory, that's true. But it's very, very important for you as a parent to understand the diagnostic criteria for your child's disability, and also to understand how that diagnostic criteria affects their ability to learn. It also is good to analyze how your child needs to be taught. And yesterday we talked about the 4 different kinds of learners, and very, very young parents can tell how their child prefers to be taught. And then we went through yesterday the different questions you can ask yourself and identify what kind of learner you have if it's not obvious. This is all very important because, for example, ADHD comes in many, 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 many different forms and faces. And let's say that a child is acting out inappropriately sexually, and their certification or eligibility is ADHD, which would come under other health disorder that affects learning. And they're trying to figure out if this behavior is a manifestation of the disability or if this is just the child misbehaving. And under our common knowledge of ADHD, we would say, oh, it has nothing to do with ADHD. But actually, it has everything to do with ADHD. Because what happens is when a child is in a situation where they can't focus and they need to focus, they have extreme anxiety. And the anxiety blurs their ability to recognize social cues or to recognize boundaries of appropriate behavior. Well, that's very different than jumping up and down in your chair because you can't sit there for 45 minutes, which is more of the common definition of what kids with ADHD do. So each child's disability is going to be very, very individually defined, and it's very important as a parent to understand all of those aspects, the popular ones and the ones that are unique to your child. The third thing, or fourth thing, I forgot, we're in different counting, is that really, there's a lot that comes into finding out that your child has a disability. I think there's a lot of guilt of how did I not know this sooner? How did this happen? As a parent, along with a lot of, if I would have, I could have, and it becomes a very anxious and emotional time. Everyone wants the best for their own child, but parents tend to bring their emotions into the IEP meeting, and that will never work out well. Yes, they are trained professionals, and it needs to be recognized that they are trying to do their best, And a lot of times parents are frustrated because they don't feel like they're being heard, or that they kind of feel betrayed if it's a disability that's discovered later. Like, how could the school have not figured this out? I don't know anything about recognizing disabilities, but they're trained to know. How could this have happened? And so those are all, it's really, really important to be able to count to 10 and keep your cool and not yell and not storm out of the room, because really at the end of the day, that will only hurt your child. There's also a lot of frustration from parents that I talk to about, oh, they had the whole IEP filled out before I even got there. It doesn't matter what I have to say. And that is not the way this process is supposed to happen. That is not what the law says should happen. And really, the IEP team, as required members, parents are required, as are many other professionals, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And it's really important for each person to have a say in the formulation of the plan and to identify the goals. And then the last error that is like the broken record rule, that I say all the time, and that is, if it's not in writing, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So they can make all the promises in the world. Parents can make all the promises in the world, and that there is no guarantee that those accommodations or supports will be delivered. And if it's not in writing, you have no recourse. Part of planning and preparing to go to the meeting, parents should track on their own through past IEPs what the different test scores are, or whatever the measurement tool is for progress in the goals. Keep track of them yourself. Have your own little Excel spreadsheet or graph or whatever you want to do, so that if the scores are going down, for example, stay-at-home order, most kids fell behind. They were going. It could be a very slow up of progress, but their progress slowed because access to education was different. So that's just one example. So that when you go to your next IEP meeting, after being able to document and show that your child didn't progress at the same rate that they were, you know what kinds of things you have to target in discussing at that meeting and what the plans need to be. So, and we'll talk more about preparing and planning for an IEP meeting tomorrow, but we're going to now jump to what is an IEP and the difference between an IEP and a 504. So as I mentioned earlier, an IEP is individualized special education and related services that meet the unique needs of a child. A 504 plan provides services and changes the learning environment to meet the needs of the child as adequately as other students. So one is dealing with special education and related services, and one is just changing the learning environment. So what it does, well, both of them are provided at no cost to the parents. The IDEA, the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, is a federal special education law where Section 504 is part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which is a federal civil rights act to stop discrimination against people with disabilities. In order to have an IEP, a child has to have one or more of 13 specific disabilities that are listed in the IDEA. Learning and attention issues may qualify under the other health-related disabilities. It depends. And this is the critical part. The disability must affect the child's educational performance or their ability to learn and benefit from the the general education curriculum, which leads to the need for the specialized instruction. A 504 plan, in order to get a 504 plan, which is a much more relaxed plan, a child has to have any disability, which includes many learning and attention issues. The disability must interfere in the child's ability to learn in general education classroom. And it has a broader definition of disability than the 13 specifically delineated disabilities in the IDEA. It must substantially limit one or more basic life activity, such as learning. So that's why a child who doesn't qualify for an IEP may be able to have a 504. You're entitled to an independent educational evaluation under the IEP. You are not under a 504. There are strict legal requirements about what must be in an IEP, who has to be at the meeting, who has to formulate it, what evaluations it must be based on, what data it must be based on, and the rules about who is on the 504 team are less specific. Basically, in an IEP, the child's parent, at least one of the child's general education teachers, at least one special ed teacher, a school psychologist, or other specialist who can interpret the evaluation results. So if your child had a speech and language comprehensive evaluation, then there should be a speech pathologist on the IEP team. There has to be a district representative with authority over special education services. The entire team must be present for the IEP meeting. Additional people can be included. For example, if your child has a nanny who supervises homework or who assists them in studying for tests, that may be someone who you'd want included in an IEP meeting. If there is a tutor, if there are any professionals that assist in the child's learning, you may want them to be present at the IEP meeting. You do have to give notice to the school district ahead of time in order for others who weren't in the enumerated list to be present at an IEP. For 504s, it's a team of people who are familiar with the child, who understand the evaluation data and special services options. And that's where you could have parents, the principal, much less formal, a general ed, special ed teacher. So as I said, much less formal environment. As far as what's in the program or plan, IEPs are usually 20 to 50 pages long. 504s really don't even have to be in writing. I would tell you that you are making a bad mistake if your 504 is not in writing. But some of the things that are important to be in the IEP are the academic and functional performance of the child. How is the child currently doing in school? That's called the baseline. There needs to be annual education goals for the child and how the school will track the progress. The services the child will get, it may include special ed, related supplementary aids, an extended school year, assistive technology. It could be getting notes before a class lecture. It could be getting individual copies of the PowerPoint. It could be preferential seating by the learning source. Kind of the sky's the limit on what you can think of as far as supports and supplementary aids. The timing of the services, when they'll start, how often they occur, and how long they last. And any accommodations or changes to the child's learning environment. It might be that they're going to take their tests in a place with no more than 2 other students, or they're going to take them alone, or their tests are going to be read out loud to them. any modifications or changes to what the child is expected to learn or know. That could be that a child does work to mastery, not to completion of assignments. It could mean they have a extra day, like a grace period, if they don't turn in an assignment that they aren't penalized for. It could be that they have a check-in, check-out person. So first thing in the morning and last thing before they go home, they have a person who gets them organized for the day, makes sure that they have all their homework with them, tells them which homework gets, or teaches them to be able to know which homework has to be turned in which class, which books or worksheets have to go home for homework, how to basically time manage, look and understand their own scheduling, which then becomes obviously more child-led and less adult-led as the child gets older. And then how the child will participate in standardized tests. So again, are they going to get extra time? Are they only going to get extra time for certain sections of the test? Are they going to take one subject per day? Are they going to take 2 subjects a day, over a couple day period of time? All of that. And how the child will be included in the general ed classes and school activities. So obviously, we want the child in the least restrictive environment and the most inclusion in general ed that they can have, that will not disrupt the integrity of the educational setting. So that is also what must be included. The reason the gen ed teacher is at the IP meeting is because it is their job to present the gen ed curriculum and how that is going to be delivered either through gen ed resources or through special ed resources. The only requirements for a 504 plan is it should have specific accommodations, supports, or services for the child. It should have the name of who's going to provide the services and the name of the person responsible for ensuring the plan is implemented. So, and as I said, it's not even required that a 504 be in writing. Often, I see it in progress notes, and it's like much less formal. It might be an email between the parents, or sometimes there's just an understanding that it's going to happen. But the problem with the understanding it's going to happen is if it doesn't happen, we have nothing to enforce. Parents are entitled to notice in for both plans. If you're challenging the plan, then parents have a right for their child to stay put, and that is a term of art. They stay put in their current placement during the dispute. There's no protection of that under a 504 plan. And both of them are reviewed yearly, and a reevaluation should be done every 3 years or as often as needed. There are very similar ways to resolve disputes, but a little different. So the IDEA specifically states that parents can mediate their problems. They can file a due process complaint. They can have a resolution session, which is a meeting with the teacher without lawyers present. They can file a civil lawsuit. They can make a state complaint for violation. They can make a federal civil rights complaint for violation, or they can sue the school district. Section 504 gives parents several options for resolving disagreements as well. And I think it's interesting that they're called disputes under the IDEA and disagreements under Section 504. But basically, there's mediation, there's alternative dispute resolution, which is like arbitration. There's an impartial hearing procedure. There's a complaint to the Civil Rights Office, or you can file a lawsuit. As I mentioned earlier, there should be no cost for accommodations or supports unless gen ed students have to pay for the same delivery of education. Field trips was my best example. Schools do not, or districts do not receive any extra funding if a child has a 504 plan. They do receive additional funding from the federal government at the state level for children who are eligible under an IEP. So the only other thing that I wanted to talk about today as we finish our little introduction here are a little bit more about some terminology. We talked about free appropriate public education and what that means. I think it's also important to understand equal access. And that's an equal opportunity of a qualified person with a disability to participate in or benefit from educational aid, benefits, or services. It's also important to understand the term placement. There are different placements. There's obviously the general education classroom, but other placements could be a resource room. It could be a room for students who are on the autism spectrum. There could be a room for students who are emotionally impaired or cognitively impaired. There could be a mild cognitively impaired classroom versus a severe cognitively impaired classroom. There could be a deaf and hard of hearing classroom. There could be a classroom for students that are paraplegic or quadriplegic. There could be, in different districts, different buildings house different programs, and not all programs are available in every district. Another placement could be a child learning at home. And there are requirements for a specific number of days for which it's determined that it is actually a change of placement for the child. It could be under a suspension, it could be under an expulsion, or it could just be a homeschooling or online schooling arrangement. Anything greater than 10 days that don't have to be consecutive is considered a change of placement. Reasonable accommodations are, it's a term used in the employment context, and it refers to modifications or adjustments employers make to a job application process, the work environment, the manner or circumstance under which the position held or desired is customarily performed, or that enable a covered entity's employee with a disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment. Basically, sometimes it's used incorrectly in the elementary and secondary school context, because we're not talking about modifications to the curriculum. We're talking about auxiliary aids or services. We're talking about academic adjustments. We're not talking about actual modifications like they're doing by putting in a ramp at a workplace. Reasonable modifications is another term that's taken out of Title II of the ADA, actually, and that has to do with practices and procedures that have to be in place to avoid discrimination. Related services is the other word that we hear a lot, and that in the elementary and secondary school context refers to developmental, corrective, and other supportive services. That's where your psychological counseling, the medical diagnostic services, accommodations for the bus, if they need an aid on the bus, or para, or they have to sit in the front, or they have to sit in the back, or you need a ramp, or you need a lift, or that all comes under related services. And all of those things can be incorporated into an IEP or a 504 plan. So that is the quickest snapshot introduction I could possibly give you of what is an IEP, what is a 504 plan, and tomorrow we will talk about how you develop an IEP plan, and the different goals and how to measure the goals and what is a proper goal as guaranteed by the IDEA versus some of the general crap goals, for lack of a better word, that I often see. The rule of thumb that I'll leave you with on if an IEP is appropriate and compliant in any given situation is whether or not a substitute teacher or someone who is an absolute stranger to your child could pick it up and know how your child learns and how they need to be taught. And that is the critical test that we look at in order to determine if it's specific enough, measurable enough, and we can monitor the progress. So with that, I will say goodbye for today. I hope that you are all healthy and enjoying the sunny day, and I will see you tomorrow to talk about developing IEPs. Bye.